I pronounce his name right. It's Enes Kanter, right? I remember him as a former NBA player. He did play during the time, I'm not going to say during the time that I actually grew up loving the NBA, because that was more or less like late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, so on and so forth. But I am familiar with Enes Kanter. I remember him as a player that was really, really heavily focused on justices that was going on in his country and bringing visibility to certain atrocities that was happening worldwide and overseas. And
I don't know how many of you have been following the whole WNBA situation over the past couple of weeks, because of course, why would you? But we've basically had this situation where, especially in response to Sophie Cunningham, a bunch of the WNBA players, coaches, team owners even, have come out in this massive campaign of support for trans athletes being allowed to play in the WNBA. In other words, they're openly inviting men to come in, take their spots, destroy the sport, and
the
claim that
WNBA just called an emergency meeting to answer one simple question. What is a woman? So yes, according to a memo obtained by the Associated Press, Commissioner Kathy Engelbert told teams the league will convene additional discussions on transgender athlete participation after two former NBA players, Enes Kanter-Freedom and Royce White, declared themselves eligible for the WNBA draft. And here's the part that should make you pause. The league's own collective bargaining agreement reportedly says, quote, only players who are women are eligible to play in the WNBA.
The WNBA may have suddenly found itself at the center of a controversy far bigger than anyone expected. What started as a basketball discussion has now spilled into heated online debates about transgender athletes, eligibility policies, and where the league goes from here. Social media is filling with demands for answers, predictions about what could happen next, and claims that the league may be facing serious scrutiny. But there is an important distinction between viral speculation and confirmed information. So the real question is not simply how loud the controversy has become. It's whether there is actually an official investigation underway, or whether social media has once again moved far ahead of the facts.
What the hell is going on with the WNBA? I know almost nothing about sports, but even I know there are biological differences between men and women. The WNBA just put out a statement basically saying if you don't want men and women's sports or men and women's locker rooms, you're hateful, divisive, basically you're a terrible person. They also try to say that we're playing politics. No one is playing politics. In fact, a majority of the country is on the same page. How is it 2026 and y'all are still trying to die on this hill? I have known there are differences between boys and girls ever since I came out of my mother's womb into this cold...
About trans women in the WNBA, which to me was just like them soft launching the fact that they're probably finna start introducing trans women into the NBA. And so, like, they've been asking all of the WNBA players how they feel about it. Let's be clear, like, even if they were against it, none of them can openly say that. They're gonna lose sponsorships.
The most revealing part of the WNBA's transgender athlete debate is that the conversation is no longer happening only in politics or online arguments. It is now colliding with the practical reality of professional sports, where broad slogans have to confront actual eligibility standards, league policies, and competitive rules. For years, debates over transgender participation in women's sports have largely played out through political campaigns, social media, court cases, school policies, and theoretical arguments about what might happen in elite competition. Now, the WNBA has become one of the places where those questions are being pushed into the real world, and that makes every policy decision far more consequential.
He's declaring himself as a WNBA prospect. So he posted this on his social media. He said, if simply declaring who you are is all that's required, then I meet every single requirement necessary to compete in the WNBA. And he basically says, based on the current guidelines, I can and am officially declaring my eligibility for the upcoming WNBA draft.
Now that debate has entered the world of professional women's basketball, where abstract arguments eventually have to meet measurable realities. At this level, the discussion is no longer purely theoretical. Physical attributes, athletic performance, roster construction, playing time, contracts, statistics, and ultimately the scoreboard all become part of the equation. That is what makes the conversation around eligibility in elite sports so complicated. Every policy has to operate within a real competitive environment where small differences can affect opportunities, roles, and outcomes. And once those questions reach a professional league like the WNBA, they become much harder to separate from the practical realities of competition.
The good news is that a bunch of these characters who seem to believe it is still peak woke, this is still 2020 and we have to do humiliation rituals like this, are about to get exactly what they wished for, which I'm honestly glad to see. It might be the first time the WNBA is worth watching because at least it'll be interesting. But to make a long story short, you first of all had a bunch of trans basketball players, especially over in European leagues and stuff like that, come out and say, oh, the WNBA wants trans athletes. Okay, we'd like to be signed. We want to go.
That collision has sparked a much broader debate involving Sophie Cunningham, Minnesota Lynx coach Cheryl Reeve, several prominent WNBA voices, and even former NBA player Enes Kanter Freedom. What began as a single basketball incident has quickly expanded into a much bigger conversation about competition, fairness, and where the league draws its boundaries.
Critical. All of these feminists who fought for years for equal rights, they were out marching in the streets with those pink pussy hats after Hillary Clinton lost. Those are the same women fighting to keep boys in the locker rooms and boys in girls' sports. So basically, these feminists who say they care about women and women's bodies, they're like, come on guys, beat the crap out of us, take away our scholarships and our gold medals that we have worked hard for our entire lives. That's the feminist movement right now. After Brittany Griner got locked up in Russia for having drugs, in this situation, the WNBA has such bad PR.
Before turning this into a claim that the WNBA is suddenly being overwhelmed by transgender players or facing some imminent shutdown, there is an important distinction that needs to be made. Supporting transgender athletes is not the same as saying the league is filling its rosters with transgender women, and predictions about the WNBA shutting down require evidence, not viral speculation. The debate became even more visible when Sophie Cunningham was increasingly associated with opposition to transgender women competing in women's basketball. Around the same period, Minnesota Lynx head coach Cheryl Reeve was seen wearing a shirt that read, "Trans kids belong." The image quickly spread online because it became a symbol in a much larger argument. For supporters of transgender inclusion, Reeve's message represented acceptance and solidarity toward a group they believe faces significant discrimination. Critics, meanwhile, argue that women's sports also have to account for biological differences and the competitive effects of male puberty. Those are fundamentally different perspectives, and reducing the debate to simple good versus bad characters misses the real policy question. The difficult issue is how a professional sports league can balance inclusion, athlete rights, competitive fairness, and the purpose of sex-based sporting categories. That is where the conversation becomes far more complicated than a viral photo, a social media argument, or a headline can make it appear.
What that means. No language on gender identity. No language on sex assigned at birth. Nothing. So now a task force of presidents and general managers are reportedly meeting next week to figure out in plain terms what a woman is. In 2026, in a professional sports league that built its entire brand around women empowerment. If you've been told for the past years that this was settled science, that questioning it made you a bigot, watch how fast that tone changes when the people asking the questions are two former NBA players testing the...
Other basketball figures have also made their positions known, although their approaches have not been identical. Golden State Valkyries coach Natalie Nakase has spoken about sports as a space where people should feel they belong, drawing on her own experiences of being judged for characteristics such as her height and ethnicity. She has argued that women and girls should have opportunities to participate and has included transgender women within that broader principle of inclusion. Other WNBA voices have similarly expressed support for transgender rights while pushing back against the idea that transgender participation should automatically be framed as a crisis for women's sports. Indiana Fever coach Stephanie White, meanwhile, has taken a more cautious position when questioned about transgender women competing in women's basketball. That difference in tone highlights why simply repeating the word inclusion doesn't fully resolve the underlying sports policy debate. Competitive sports are built around eligibility rules and categories for a reason. Age divisions separate younger athletes from adults. Combat sports use weight classes because physical differences can affect competition. Paralympic sport uses detailed classification systems to create meaningful competitive categories. The difficult question, then, is not whether sports should have rules or categories. They clearly do. The real debate is where those boundaries should be drawn, what evidence should determine them, and how a league can balance inclusion with competitive fairness.
Laugh. I don't know whether to cry because, like I've said in other videos, this league is the anything but basketball league. The storylines around this league are never about basketball. And I didn't realize what I was signing up for by covering this league to the extent that I have been covering it for the past 3 years. Like, I actually like sports. I don't want to talk about politics. I don't want to talk about drama and negativity. And it's literally
certain atrocities that was happening. worldwide and overseas and so on and so forth. But you are now seeing people brave enough, come on, let's talk about it, brave enough to have a conversation based on what they established as a standard in America, right? And so whereas we become so woke and we've been in...
Women's sports exist as a distinct competitive category because athletic performance can differ substantially between males and females, particularly following puberty. That makes the central policy question more complicated than simply asking whether inclusion is a positive value. The real issue is whether a particular eligibility policy can provide inclusion while still preserving the competitive purpose of the women's category. That is where Cunningham and athletes who share similar concerns enter the debate. Their argument is generally framed around competitive boundaries rather than an individual athlete's dignity or personal identity. Critics of transgender women competing in female categories often point to physiological differences associated with male puberty, including differences in skeletal structure, muscle mass, strength, power, and cardiovascular capacity. How much those factors matter depends heavily on the sport. In basketball, for example, characteristics such as height, reach, explosiveness, and acceleration can have obvious competitive relevance. That is also why sports organizations have reached different conclusions instead of adopting one universal standard. What works for one sport may not necessarily translate directly to another. There is another important factual distinction that often gets lost in the online debate. The amount of discussion surrounding transgender participation in the WNBA is considerably larger than the publicly established number of transgender athletes actually occupying WNBA roster spots. So before describing the league as being flooded with transgender players, it is important to separate the size of the public controversy from the available evidence about actual participation. Those are not necessarily the same thing.
For the Republicans, I've seen in a long time, but also it's not a gotcha, which is how dumb they are. Really all this proves is that you can't trust cis straight men, which women have been saying for years. That's why we choose the bear. There has never been a trans woman in the WNBA in the history of the WNBA in 30 seasons. Not a single one. But this guy, who admittedly isn't transitioning, isn't transgender, is still going by he, him pronouns, is declaring
yes, except for Sophie Cunningham, which is basically how all of this discourse started. That's because she has the Republicans on her side, right? Which is a large segment of WNBA basketball watchers, by the way. What the WNBA is really trying to do to see if they can, get something to slide past their consumer base, because let's be clear, the NBA is a business, right? At the end of the day, what the NBA is trying to establish is, will they become more profitable